Racist woman accuses black man of trespassing, then finds out he owns the land. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a woman named Karen stood at her kitchen window, sipping her morning coffee. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. It was a typical Saturday, and she had planned to spend her day organizing her home and preparing for the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. As she gazed out at the landscape, her eyes caught sight of a black man walking along a pathway that led to a beautiful piece of land adjacent to her property. The man, tall and athletic, wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, and he walked with purpose, seemingly absorbed in his surroundings. But Karen's heart raced with indignation at the sight. The land, which had recently been the subject of discussions among her neighbors regarding potential development, had always been a point of contention for her. Fuming at the sight, she assumed he was trespassing. "Who does he think he is?" she muttered under her breath, her face flushing with anger. Clenching her phone tightly, she marched toward him, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. With each step, her indignation grew. She felt a strong need to defend what she believed was her territory. As she approached, she called out to him. "Hey, what are you doing on my property?" she demanded, her voice laced with authority. The man turned to her, a look of confusion crossing his face. "Excuse me," he replied, raising an eyebrow. "I'm just taking a walk." Karen's blood boiled. "This is private property. You need to leave immediately." She stood firm, arms crossed over her chest, determined to assert her dominance in this confrontation. The man, who introduced himself as James, remained calm despite the escalation of her tone. "Ma'am, I'm just enjoying a walk. I'm not trying to cause any trouble," he replied, maintaining eye contact with her. His voice was steady, almost soothing, but Karen was not having it. "Do you think I'm going to let you just stroll around here? You're trespassing." Karen continued, her heart racing with a mix of anger and a sense of superiority. She couldn't understand why he was so unfazed by her accusations. To her, he represented everything that was wrong with the world, an outsider who didn't respect her neighborhood. James shook his head, still trying to reason with her. "Ma'am, this land belongs to me. I'm actually here to check on a construction project I'm developing." He gestured toward the vast expanse of land behind him, where construction equipment was parked and stakes marked future buildings. "Liar." Karen shot back, disbelief etched across her features. She felt her face grow warm, fueled by her unyielding conviction that she was right. "You think you can just come here and do whatever you want? I won't let you." The tone of her voice turned from accusatory to downright hostile, and she reached for her phone. "Watch me call the police," she warned, her fingers trembling with rage as she dialed the number. James stood still, realizing that she was not interested in listening to reason. As she waited for the call to connect, Karen's mind raced. She imagined how the police would show up, how they would side with her, and how they would arrest him for trespassing. "Yes, hello? I have a trespasser on my property," she spoke into the phone, her tone filled with indignation. "He's a black man, and he's trying to invade my space." James watched her, incredulous. The prejudiced undertones of her statement were glaring, but he remained composed. "Ma'am, you're making a mistake. I own this land," he insisted, trying to maintain his dignity amidst the chaos. "What's your name?" Karen demanded, glaring at him as if she were interrogating a criminal. "You don't belong here." She was determined to have him removed, believing it was her right to defend her territory at all costs. "I've already told you. My name is James, and I'm here on my property. I'm inspecting a new construction project," he replied, his patience wearing thin. But her eyes were locked onto her phone, her focus solely on the conversation with the police. "Please hurry. I don't feel safe with him here," she insisted, her voice dripping with disdain. Minutes passed, feeling like hours to both of them. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as two police cars pulled up to the curb. Karen felt a rush of adrenaline. She was certain justice was on her side. The officer stepped out, assessing the situation as they approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of the officers greeted, looking at Karen first. "What seems to be the problem?" "This man is trespassing on my property," she exclaimed, pointing an accusatory finger at James. "He doesn't belong here, and I want him arrested." The officers turned to James, who remained calm. "I'm sorry for the confusion, officers. My name is James, and I own this land. I'm here to inspect a construction project," he explained, pulling out some documents to prove his ownership. The officers exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by the situation. "Ma'am, can you provide proof of ownership of this property?" one of them asked Karen. "Of course I can," she stammered, fumbling through her belongings. I just have to find it." As the officers waited, James took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. He could feel the tension in the air, the injustice of the moment weighing heavily on him. He pulled out his identification and the property documents from his bag, showing them to the officers. "Here's the proof," he said, his voice steady. "I own the entire area. I was just checking in on my project." The officers reviewed the documents, and as they confirmed his ownership, the truth began to dawn on them. They turned back to Karen, who stood frozen, her face pale. "Ma'am, it appears that Mr. James is indeed the owner of this property." "You were mistaken," one officer stated, his tone firm yet respectful. Karen felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. "No, that can't be right. I saw him here, and he looked suspicious," she protested, but her voice was faltering. "Your assumptions based on his appearance are unfounded," the other officer replied, clearly displeased with her actions. "You can't just accuse someone of trespassing without evidence." As the officers explained the situation further, Karen's mind raced. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she realized the gravity of her prejudices. She had not only made a false accusation, but had also wasted police resources with her assumptions. "Ma'am," one of the officers said gently, "you need to understand that this type of behavior can have serious consequences. Accusations based on race are not only unfounded, but also harmful." The weight of those words struck her hard, and she found it increasingly difficult to argue her case. James stood silently, feeling a mix of relief and sadness for the woman who had judged him so harshly. Karen's defensiveness crumbled. I didn't know. I just thought. I saw him walking around here, and..." Her voice trailed off, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I understand it can be uncomfortable when we see someone we don't recognize in our neighborhood," James interjected calmly. "But we have to confront our biases and assumptions. They only lead to misunderstandings and division." After the officers concluded their business and left, Karen stood there, feeling the weight of her actions. The encounter had turned her world upside down, forcing her to confront her own biases and prejudices. She turned to James, who was gathering his things. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I judged you without knowing anything about you." James paused, looking at her with a mix of compassion and understanding. "It's okay. This happens all too often," he replied. "But it's important to learn from it. We all have biases we need to confront, and this is an opportunity for growth." Karen nodded, her heart heavy, but filled with a desire to change. She knew that this moment would stick with her forever, a turning point that would compel her to question her own beliefs and actions. As James walked away, he glanced back at her. "I hope you take this lesson to heart," he said, offering a small smile. "Change begins with us." In the weeks that followed, Karen made a conscious effort to engage with her community in a more meaningful way. She reached out to her neighbors, participating in discussions about diversity and inclusion, and she even joined local initiatives aimed at fostering understanding among different cultures. Slowly but surely, she began to change her perspective, realizing that her assumptions had created barriers between herself and the world around her. James' kindness in the face of her prejudice inspired her to be more open-minded and empathetic. The neighborhood barbecue, which she had originally planned to prepare for, became a celebration of unity, with diverse dishes and stories shared among neighbors of different backgrounds. Karen found herself connecting with people she would have previously overlooked and she realized that her world had become richer because of it. Through that fateful encounter, Karen learned that confronting her biases was not just about correcting her own mistakes, it was about building bridges and fostering understanding. James had unknowingly sparked a change in her that she would carry forward for the rest of her life, a reminder that growth often comes from the most uncomfortable moments. And in the quiet suburban neighborhood, where the sun rose over familiar paths and homes, a new sense of community began to blossom, united in their commitment to understanding and embracing one another's differences. "Who do you think you are walking around here?" Karen shouted, her voice echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. The sun hung high in the sky, illuminating the pristine lawns and manicured gardens that defined her suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped nearby, oblivious to the brewing tension. Karen felt her heart racing, a cocktail of anger and adrenaline surging through her veins. She had never encountered someone like this in her neighborhood, and the very thought of an unfamiliar face roaming her territory filled her with indignation. "This is private property. You need to leave." She didn't care if her voice was harsh. She was determined to reclaim her space. To her, this land was an extension of her identity, a piece of her life that she had cultivated meticulously. She had fought for years to maintain the integrity of her neighborhood against perceived threats, loud parties, unruly children, and now, what she believed to be an unwelcome trespasser. James, the man in question, stood still, processing her accusations. His demeanor was remarkably calm, a stark contrast to Karen's furious outburst. "Ma'am, I'm just taking a walk. This land belongs to me," he explained, gesturing toward the vast expanse around them. He pointed at the "no trespassing" signs that had recently been installed, which now seemed to taunt Karen. "I own this property, and I have every right to be here." Karen felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but she was not ready to back down. The way he spoke, so matter-of-factly, only fueled her anger. "You think you can just come here and do whatever you want? You don't belong here." Her heart thudded in her chest as she tried to maintain her composure. In her mind, she replayed the narrative she had built around her community, a narrative where she felt safe and in control. The thought of someone else encroaching on that territory was unacceptable. "This neighborhood is peaceful, and I won't let anyone disturb it," she thought vehemently, her protective instincts kicking in. James observed Karen's escalating agitation. He could sense her hostility, but remained focused on de-escalating the situation. "I understand that it might be surprising to see someone you don't recognize," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But I assure you, I'm not here to cause any trouble." Karen scoffed at his words, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "Trouble? You're already causing trouble by just being here." Her mind raced with possibilities, all centered around the notion that he was somehow dangerous or had ill intentions. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to protect her home, even if that meant confronting someone who didn't deserve her wrath. "I'm just out for a walk," James reiterated, his patience wearing thin. "This area is beautiful, and I like to take in the scenery." He glanced around, appreciating the natural beauty of the land that surrounded them. "I'm working on a project here, and I want to ensure everything is going smoothly." Karen's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. "What kind of project?" she shot back, skepticism lacing her tone. "You're not going to turn this place into some sort of eyesore, are you?" The thought of loud machinery and disruptive construction sent a shiver down her spine. James took a breath, trying to contain his frustration. "I'm developing a few homes, but they're designed to blend in with the natural environment. I want to maintain the beauty of this area, not ruin it." He gestured again, this time indicating the untouched landscape behind him. "I have plans that are meant to enhance the community, not detract from it." "Enhance? Or gentrify?" Karen's voice dripped with sarcasm as she stepped closer, feeling emboldened by her conviction. "You think you can come here and just change everything?" She felt a rush of indignation, her perception of the situation skewed by her own biases. James was taken aback by her hostility. "I assure you, that's not my intention," he said, his voice remaining calm despite her aggression. "I want to create a space where people can thrive, not displace anyone." Karen crossed her arms, refusing to let his calm demeanor sway her. "You think I'm just going to believe you?" she shot back, her tone accusatory. "You could be lying."
"I don't even know you."
James sighed, recognizing the futility of trying to reason with her. "Look, I'm happy to show you the plans." "You can see exactly what I'm working on," he offered, hoping to provide some clarity. But Karen was not interested in understanding. "Plans? What kind of plans? Just because you have some paper doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want." Frustration began to boil within him. He had dealt with his share of skepticism in the past, but this felt different. The hostility radiating from Karen was palpable, a product of her own fears and prejudices. "I get that you're concerned, but I'm not the enemy here," he said, trying to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. "Then why are you here?" she pressed, her tone still aggressive. "Why don't you just go back to wherever you came from? This isn't your place." In that moment, James felt a mixture of sadness and anger. He had worked hard to be where he was, to earn his place in this world. "I'm here because I want to make a positive impact," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension. "I'm not trying to disrupt your life. I'm trying to improve it. But what you call improvement, I see as a threat." Karen retorted, her voice rising. "You don't understand what this neighborhood means to us. We've fought for years to keep it safe and peaceful." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. James could see that this wasn't just about the land. It was about her identity, her place in the world. But he also knew that fear could distort reality, leading people to act against their better judgment. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern for your community, but this land belongs to me. I'm here legally, and I have every right to be here," he said, trying to reclaim control over the narrative. For a brief moment, the tension shifted, and Karen's bravado wavered. She hesitated, and doubt crept into her expression. But then, as quickly as it had come, her defensiveness returned. "I don't care if you have the papers," she snapped. "I don't want you here." At that moment, James realized that he was not just dealing with a disagreement over property. He was up against deeply rooted biases and fears that had shaped Karen's worldview. "Look, I don't want this to escalate," he said, attempting to de-escalate the situation further. "Let's just talk calmly. I'm not your enemy." But Karen was beyond reason. "I don't need to talk to you. I'll call the police," she declared, pulling out her phone with a determination that left James stunned. "Call the police?" he echoed, incredulous. "For what? Because I'm walking on my own land?" "Exactly," Karen replied, her voice rising again. "You don't belong here. You're invading my space." James felt the wave of frustration wash over him. How could she be so blind to the reality of the situation? "Ma'am, I promise you, this is my land," he stated firmly. "I'm not trying to invade anything. I'm simply going about my day." "Then prove it," Karen shouted back, the defensiveness in her voice a shield against her growing fear. "Show me some identification." James took a deep breath, reminding himself to remain calm. "I can show you my identification," he said, reaching for his wallet. "But I really don't think this is necessary. I'm not trying to cause trouble." In that moment, Karen felt a surge of power as she held the narrative in her hands. She thought about how the police would arrive, how they would listen to her side of the story, and how they would ultimately side with her. "I'm going to show you what happens when you disrespect my home," she thought defiantly. She dialed 911, her heart racing with a mix of adrenaline and vindication. "Yes, I need the police," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos brewing inside her. "There's a trespasser on my property, and I need you to send someone right away." James stood there, his heart sinking as he realized how deeply entrenched Karen's biases were. He had hoped for understanding, for dialogue, but instead, he was faced with hostility and ignorance. "This is a waste of everyone's time," he thought, but he knew better than to let his frustration show. "Ma'am, I can assure you this will only escalate things," he said, trying one last time to reason with her. "The police don't need to be involved in this. We can settle this without creating a scene." But Karen was beyond reason, her mind locked in a cycle of fear and anger. "You don't get to dictate what happens here," she shot back, her resolve hardening. I'll make sure everyone knows you don't belong here." As she hung up, the gravity of the situation settled in. James couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness for her, for the walls she had built around herself. "You could have had a different story, a better understanding of this community," he thought, wishing that they could have shared a moment of connection rather than confrontation. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the police to arrive, the tension between them thick and palpable. Karen's mind raced with a mixture of triumph and anxiety. She was doing what she thought was right, defending her home, but deep down, a small voice whispered doubts that she quickly silenced. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as the police car approached. Karen felt a rush of adrenaline, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is it," she thought, "the moment justice is served." As the police officers stepped out of their vehicle, James remained composed, hoping that they would see through the chaos and recognize the truth. But as he caught sight of the officers' stern faces, a sense of dread washed over him. "Here we go," he thought, bracing himself for what was to come. Unfazed by his words, Karen pulled out her phone and called the police, convinced that she was in the right. "Yes, there's a trespasser on my property," she reported, her tone filled with disdain. "I need someone to come and take care of this immediately." The adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel powerful, as if she were standing on the moral high ground. She was certain that the officers would support her claim, providing her with the backing she felt was necessary to confront the man she viewed as a threat. As she hung up, a sense of vindication washed over her. After all, she was the homeowner, the one who had worked hard to build her life in this neighborhood. In her mind, she was a protector, guarding the sanctity of her community against those she perceived as outsiders. The thought of being supported by the police, the very embodiment of law and order, bolstered her confidence. James stood nearby, watching Karen with a mix of disbelief and disappointment. He had hoped that their conversation could lead to understanding, but instead, it had spiraled into an ugly confrontation fueled by fear and ignorance. As he waited for the officers to arrive, he tried to remain calm, knowing that his composure could speak volumes when they arrived. The air felt heavy with tension, and every passing second seemed to stretch into an eternity. Karen glanced at James with a smirk, her demeanor brimming with self-righteousness. "You're going to regret trespassing here," she said defiantly, folding her arms as she adopted a stance of superiority. "The police will sort you out, and you'll see just how wrong you are." James remained silent, choosing to ignore her taunts. Instead, he focused on gathering his thoughts, reminding himself of the importance of patience in moments like these. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a collision of worldviews, a confrontation between his reality and Karen's biases. Minutes crawled by, the sun still shining brightly overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. James's mind raced as he reflected on the absurdity of the situation. He had walked this land countless times, often feeling a deep connection to it. Each step he took was filled with purpose and pride as he envisioned the homes he planned to build, homes that would welcome families and foster community. Karen's voice broke through his thoughts again. "What's it like to be such a pathetic loser?" she sneered. "You think you can just stroll in here and take over? You're nothing but a trespasser." James closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to center himself. He had learned to rise above the negativity that sometimes surrounded him, especially when faced with people who refused to see beyond their own prejudices. "I'm not a loser. I'm a homeowner," he replied calmly. "You'll see that soon enough." But Karen only laughed, her disdain echoing in the empty space between them. "Homeowner? Right. As if that means anything here. You don't belong." She reveled in the belief that her position was unassailable. She had grown up believing that her skin color and her neighborhood status meant she was entitled to her opinions, no matter how misguided they might be. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet afternoon, and Karen felt a rush of excitement. "Here they are," she exclaimed, her eyes lighting up as she saw the police vehicle pull up. "You're going to regret messing with me." James glanced at the approaching officers, his heart sinking slightly as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. As the officers stepped out of their car, he was struck by the gravity of the situation. They appeared serious, ready to address what they had been called for. He hoped that they would see through the facade that Karen had constructed, but he also understood the challenges they faced in navigating such volatile interactions. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" one of the officers asked as they approached Karen, who wasted no time in launching into her narrative. "This man is trespassing on my property," she declared, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "I've asked him to leave, but he refuses and is acting threatening." James could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on him, and he stepped forward, determined to present his side of the story. "Excuse me, officers," he interjected, maintaining a respectful tone. "I'd like to explain my presence here." The second officer turned his attention to James, sizing him up for a moment before nodding for him to continue. "Go ahead," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "I own this land," James stated, trying to convey a sense of calm authority. "I've been walking the property to inspect a construction project that I'm developing here. I have all the legal documents to prove it." Karen scoffed at his explanation, unwilling to accept his claim. "You think just because you say you own it, it makes it true? Show them your papers," she snapped, her anger flaring again. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the documents that proved his ownership. "Here are the deeds and the plans for the development," he said, holding them out for the officers to examine. "I've been in contact with the city about this project for months. I'm not here to cause trouble." The officers took the documents, glancing between them and James. After a moment of review, the first officer looked up, a quizzical expression on his face. "Ma'am, it appears that this man does indeed own the land," he said, turning his attention back to Karen. "You might want to reconsider your accusations." Karen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "That doesn't matter. He doesn't belong here. He's a threat to our community," she exclaimed, desperation creeping into her voice. "Ma'am, it's important to understand that ownership rights come with certain legal protections," the officer explained patiently. "If he is the rightful owner, he has every right to be here. You cannot accuse someone of trespassing without evidence." James felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the officers would recognize the absurdity of Karen's accusations. He glanced at her, noticing the growing frustration etched on her features. "Listen, I just wanted to enjoy my property and take a walk," he said, trying to maintain a peaceful demeanor. "I had no intention of causing any trouble, and I certainly didn't want to intrude on anyone." But Karen wasn't finished. "What about the noise? The construction? This is a peaceful neighborhood," she pressed, her voice filled with indignation. "Ma'am, there are regulations in place that govern construction and noise levels," one of the officers responded. "As long as he adheres to those regulations, there's not much that can be done from a legal standpoint." Karen's frustration boiled over. "You don't understand. He's ruining our way of life," she shouted, her voice rising in pitch. "This neighborhood is supposed to be safe. We don't want outsiders coming in and ruining everything we've built." James felt a twinge of sadness at her words. This wasn't just about property. It was about fear of change, fear of the unknown. "I'm not here to ruin anything," he reiterated, his voice steady. "I want to create a community that enhances this area, not disrupt it." The officers exchanged glances, clearly trying to navigate the tense dynamics at play. "Ma'am, it's essential to recognize that change can be challenging, but it's also a part of life," one officer said diplomatically. "As long as he's acting within the law, he's entitled to pursue his plans." Karen's expression hardened, but she sensed the tide turning against her. The police were not siding with her. They were presenting a logical and fair perspective. "I won't stand for this," she spat, her tone filled with venom. "You can't just let him walk all over us." "Ma'am, we need to remain calm and respectful," the second officer warned, trying to defuse the escalating tension. Threats and accusations won't help the situation. James took a step back, allowing the officers to guide the conversation. He could feel the energy shifting, and he hoped it would lead to a resolution. "Look, if it helps, I'm more than willing to meet with you and your neighbors to discuss the project and answer any questions you may have," he offered. "I want to be transparent about what I'm doing." Why would we want to meet with you? Karen shot back, her tone laden with contempt. You're just going to try to sweet-talk us into accepting your plans. Because I believe in collaboration, James replied, his voice steady. This is not just about me. It's about everyone in the community. We can work together to create something positive. Karen's resolve began to crack, but she quickly masked it with hostility. I don't need to work with someone like you, she snapped. You think you can just come in and change everything without considering us? Ma'am, it's about mutual respect and understanding, the first officer interjected. If he's willing to engage with you and the community, it's an opportunity to voice your concerns and have a say in what happens here. As the officers continued to speak, James noticed the subtle shift in Karen's expression. Her anger was still present, but it was accompanied by a hint of uncertainty. I don't need his pity, she muttered under her breath, but James caught her eye, and for a moment, he saw something more: fear and vulnerability. The officers concluded their discussions, urging both parties to find common ground. If you're willing to engage, it could lead to a better understanding, one officer suggested. But this animosity isn't going to help anyone. Karen turned away, folding her arms tightly against her chest, refusing to meet James's gaze. I'll think about it, she huffed, her voice tinged with reluctance. James nodded, hoping to diffuse the lingering tension. That's all I ask, he said gently. I want to create a place that feels like home for everyone. As the officers prepared to leave, they reminded Karen to reach out if she had any further concerns. We'll be here if you need us, the second officer said, his tone encouraging. Once they were gone, a heavy silence settled between Karen and James. The moment felt surreal, as if they were both processing what had just happened. Look, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, James finally said, breaking the silence. I didn't mean to upset you. I just want to be a part of this community. Karen's eyes narrowed as she regarded him. You think you can just come here and claim you own the place? It doesn't work that way. James took a deep breath, realizing that he had to stand firm in his conviction. I may own the land, but I want to earn the trust of the community. I know it takes time. Trust? You think you deserve our trust? Karen scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Yes, he replied firmly. I believe that we can build something together, but it starts with communication and understanding. As they stood on the threshold of a new reality, both Karen and James realized they were at a crossroads. Would they choose confrontation, or could they step towards collaboration? The answer lay ahead, waiting to be discovered. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Karen couldn't shake the encounter from her mind, replaying every moment over and over. Each time she thought of James, she felt a mix of anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, a realization that perhaps her perception had been clouded by her own biases. James, too, felt the weight of their confrontation. He had hoped for a peaceful interaction, but the reality was far from it. Still, he remained committed to his vision of creating a community that would embrace diversity and foster connection. As the weekend approached, Karen found herself wrestling with her thoughts. She decided to take a walk to clear her mind, a familiar route that led her to a local park. The air was crisp, and the golden leaves crunched beneath her feet. As she walked, she noticed families enjoying the day, laughing, playing, and sharing moments that seemed to transcend the boundaries of their differences. At that moment, she felt a stirring in her heart. Perhaps she had been too quick to judge, too wrapped up in her fears to see the bigger picture. What if James truly wants to contribute positively to our community? She pondered. The thought was uncomfortable, yet liberating. Meanwhile, James was also reflecting on the encounter. He spent time reviewing his construction plans and considering ways to engage the community. He envisioned hosting an open meeting to discuss the project and gather input from his neighbors. After a few days of contemplation, Karen made a decision. She would attend the meeting if James held one, willing to hear him out. It was a small step, but it felt significant. On the day of the meeting, James prepared himself, setting up chairs and tables in the community center. He wanted to create an inviting atmosphere, one that encouraged open dialogue. As neighbors began to trickle in, he greeted them warmly, hoping to ease any tension that lingered from their previous encounter. When Karen arrived, her heart raced. She felt apprehensive yet determined. As she entered the room, she caught sight of James speaking to a small group, his demeanor friendly and approachable. It struck her how different he appeared outside of their confrontation. As the meeting began, James introduced himself and outlined his vision for the land. "I want to create homes that respect the character of our neighborhood while also providing new opportunities for families," he explained passionately. He invited everyone to share their thoughts and concerns. Karen listened intently as other neighbors spoke up, some in support of James's plans, others expressing skepticism. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment. I want to understand more about this project," she began, her voice shaky. "I was wrong to accuse you without knowing the facts." James met her gaze with genuine understanding. "Thank you for saying that, Karen. I appreciate your willingness to engage in this conversation. My hope is that we can all work together to make this a better place." As the meeting continued, they began to find common ground. Karen shared her concerns about preserving the neighborhood's charm, while James explained how he planned to integrate those elements into his designs. Gradually, the tension between them began to dissolve, replaced by a shared commitment to their community. By the end of the meeting, Karen felt lighter. It was not just about the project, it was about the possibility of connection and understanding. As she left the community center, she glanced back at James, who was chatting with another neighbor. For the first time, she saw him not as an outsider, but as someone who could potentially enhance their community. The journey ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but both Karen and James had taken the first steps toward building a bridge. They learned that sometimes it takes courage to confront one's biases and a willingness to listen to one another. In a world that often feels divided, they discovered the power of empathy and understanding, a lesson that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of their suburban neighborhood. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance, and the sound of tires screeching to a halt broke the tension that hung heavily in the air. Two police officers stepped out of their vehicle, their expressions serious as they surveyed the situation. Karen stood tall, her posture rigid, pointing dramatically at James as if he were a criminal on trial. "He's trespassing," she shouted, her voice ringing with authority and a hint of desperation. "I want him arrested." The officers exchanged glances, assessing the unfolding scene with the practiced calm of those accustomed to handling disputes. One officer, a burly man with a buzz cut, approached Karen first. "Ma'am, can you provide proof of ownership of this land?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm, designed to get to the heart of the matter. Karen's confident demeanor faltered for a moment, her eyes darting between the officers and James. "He's been walking around here like he owns the place," she insisted, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from the truth. "I've lived here for years. I know what's going on in my neighborhood, and he doesn't belong here." James, remaining composed despite the pressure, took a step forward. "Officers, I can show you the paperwork that proves my ownership of this land," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a neatly folded set of documents, his hands steady as he presented them to the officers. "I've been planning to develop this property, and I have all the necessary permits." The other officer, a slender woman with long dark hair, examined the documents as she spoke. "Let's take a look at what you have, sir." She opened the papers, scanning them carefully, while the burly officer continued to engage with Karen. "And you, ma'am, do you have any evidence to support your claims?" Karen hesitated, her previous bravado giving way to frustration. "I don't need evidence. Just look at him. He doesn't belong here, and we all know it." Her voice rose in pitch, betraying the uncertainty that was beginning to bubble beneath the surface. "He's not from our community. You have to see that he's causing a disturbance." The officers listened patiently, their expressions unreadable. "Disturbance or not, we need facts to support any accusations," the burly officer replied, returning his attention to James. "Let's start with what you've got." As James explained his plans for the property, outlining how he intended to integrate it into the existing neighborhood, the officers continued to review the documentation. They noted the permits, maps, and zoning approvals, all confirming that he was indeed the rightful owner. So, you're saying you want to build homes here? The woman officer asked, looking up from the papers. Yes, James replied, his voice steady. I want to create a community that respects the character of the neighborhood while also providing affordable housing options. I thought it would be a positive addition. The officers exchanged glances again, their expressions softening slightly. And you've done your due diligence with the city? The burly officer asked, looking for confirmation. James nodded. Absolutely. I've had meetings with city officials, and everything is in line with local regulations. He could see the officers were beginning to understand that there was more to the situation than Karen had initially portrayed. Ma'am, I understand that this situation has made you uncomfortable. The woman officer addressed Karen, her tone more empathetic. But we have to approach this objectively. It's important for us to understand the full context before making any judgments. Karen's frustration bubbled over again. This is about more than just property rights, she exclaimed. This is about our community. We can't just let anyone come in and do whatever they want without considering how it affects us. Understood, the burly officer said, maintaining his composure. But we also have to respect property rights. If he has the legal right to be here, then we can't just take him away because you're uncomfortable. James could see that Karen was struggling to find her footing. He decided to try a different approach. Karen, I understand your concerns, he said, his voice calm and measured. I really do. If you'd like, I'm open to discussing my plans with you and your neighbors. I want to address any issues you may have directly. Karen's eyes narrowed as she considered his offer. She hadn't expected him to be conciliatory, and it threw her off balance. You think that just because you offer to talk, I'm going to be okay with this? She challenged, though her voice had lost some of its edge. I'm not asking you to be okay with anything, James replied sincerely. I'm just asking for a chance to explain myself and show you that my intentions are good. I want to be part of this community, not an enemy. The officers looked on, sensing the tension in the air. It sounds like there's potential for dialogue, the woman officer said thoughtfully. Maybe you two can work this out without us getting involved further. Karen scoffed but couldn't deny that James had shown willingness to engage. Fine, she replied, crossing her arms tightly. But I want to make it clear that I won't just stand by and let this happen without a fight. Our neighborhood matters to me. James nodded, recognizing the deep-seated protectiveness she felt for her home. I appreciate that, and I promise I'll take your concerns seriously, he said earnestly. The burly officer looked at both of them, a hint of relief washing over his features. Okay, we're going to step back for now. If you both feel there's a path forward, we'll trust that you can work this out. But remember, if things escalate again, don't hesitate to call us back. As the officers prepared to leave, James felt a mix of hope and uncertainty. He had made progress, but he knew there was still a long way to go before he could truly be accepted in the community. Once the police car drove away, an awkward silence fell between James and Karen. The air was thick with unspoken words, and both of them could feel the tension lingering. Well, this isn't over, Karen said, breaking the silence. No, it's not, James agreed. But we can either choose to be adversaries or find a way to work together. Karen regarded him with skepticism, but there was also a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice softer now, stripped of its previous hostility. Why not just do your thing and ignore us? Because I believe in community, James replied, his sincerity evident. I want to create something that benefits everyone, not just myself. It's not just about building houses, it's about building relationships. She looked away, processing his words. You're really different from what I thought, she admitted reluctantly. Different isn't always bad, James replied gently. It can be an opportunity for growth. Karen hesitated, her defenses wavering. I want what's best for my neighbors and my family, she confessed. I guess I thought you were just going to bulldoze in and ruin everything we've built. James took a step closer, sensing a shift in her attitude. I understand that fear, he said. It's not easy to see someone new coming into a place you've called home for so long. But I want to hear your ideas. Maybe there's a way to create something that respects the past while also embracing the future. For the first time, Karen looked at him not as a threat, but as a potential ally. "Okay, I'll consider it," she said, her voice still cautious, but open to the possibility. With that small step, a glimmer of hope ignited between them. They both understood that the road ahead would require patience and communication. The arrival of the police, which had threatened to escalate into confrontation, had unexpectedly opened the door to a conversation that could transform animosity into understanding. As they parted ways that afternoon, Karen felt a lingering sense of uncertainty, but also a spark of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chance to bridge the divide that had initially separated them. And as James walked away, he too felt the weight of hope settle into his heart. He had taken the first step toward building a community, one conversation at a time. As the tension escalated, James pulled out his identification and property documents from his bag. With a calm demeanor, he stated, "I'm the owner of this land, and I'm here to inspect a new construction project." He held the papers firmly in his hands, his gaze steady on the officers, hoping to convey the seriousness of his situation. The officers exchanged glances, realizing the gravity of the situation as their initial impressions began to shift. The burly officer stepped closer, his brow furrowed with concern. "Let's take a look at those documents," he instructed, extending his hand toward James. The slender officer shifted her focus as well, preparing to scrutinize the papers that could potentially clear James of any wrongdoing. James unfolded the documents carefully, revealing a neatly organized collection of permits, ownership titles, and a blueprint of the proposed construction project. "This is my identification, and these are the legal documents that prove my ownership," he explained, keeping his tone measured and professional. "I've been planning this project for months, and everything is in compliance with local regulations." As the officers examined the papers, James felt a swell of anxiety. He could sense Karen's gaze boring into him, her previous confidence beginning to wane. The burly officer leafed through the documents, nodding slowly as he confirmed their legitimacy. "Everything seems to be in order here," he said, glancing back at his partner for confirmation. "Yeah," the woman officer added, her voice steady. "These documents indicate that you own this property and you have the right to be here." She looked at Karen, who stood with arms crossed, visibly shaken. "Ma'am, the facts are clear. Mr. James has the legal right to be on this land." Karen's expression shifted from indignation to disbelief. But I saw him walking around like he didn't belong here," she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. "I thought he was trespassing," the woman officer responded. "It's understandable to feel uneasy, but that doesn't justify an accusation without evidence. It's important to remember that not everyone who walks through a neighborhood is a threat, especially if they have the right to be there." James took a breath, trying to remain calm amidst the unfolding revelation. "I understand your concerns, Karen," he said, turning to her. "I didn't mean to intrude or make anyone uncomfortable. I was just inspecting the land, as I mentioned earlier. I'm here to create something beneficial for the community." "Beneficial?" Karen echoed, still grappling with the reality of the situation. "How can I trust that your plans won't disrupt our way of life?" Her voice wavered, torn between her preconceived notions and the new information presented before her. James sensed an opportunity to build a bridge rather than a wall. "Let me show you my plans," he suggested earnestly. "I genuinely want to involve the community in this process. I believe that together, we can ensure that the development respects the character of the neighborhood." The officers, sensing the rising tension, encouraged the dialogue. "It's good that you're willing to communicate," the burly officer said, looking at Karen. "Sometimes misunderstandings arise from a lack of information. If you can share your intentions with her, it might alleviate some of her concerns." Karen hesitated, still caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. I'm worried about what changes might come," she admitted, her voice softer now, reflecting the vulnerability beneath her earlier bravado. "I love this neighborhood, and I don't want it to lose its charm." James nodded, understanding the roots of her anxiety. "That's valid, and I share that concern. My goal isn't to change everything, it's to enhance what's already here. I envision a development that complements the existing homes, perhaps even a community garden or public space that residents can enjoy. The officers observed the conversation with interest, sensing that a breakthrough was happening. "This could be a good opportunity for a community meeting," the woman officer suggested. "You could invite residents to discuss the plans, ask for feedback, and address any questions they might have." James felt a flicker of hope. "That's an excellent idea. I'd be happy to organize a meeting to present my vision and gather input from everyone," he replied. "I want to build something we can all be proud of." Karen looked contemplative, her arms slowly uncrossing as she processed his words. "A meeting could help," she finally conceded, her voice more reflective than accusatory. "But it's going to take time for people to trust you. This isn't just about one person's opinion. It's about the community." "Absolutely," James agreed. "Trust is earned, and I'm willing to put in the effort. I want to work collaboratively, and I'm open to feedback." The officers nodded in approval, relieved to see the tension diffusing. "Just remember, it's important to communicate openly with your neighbors," the burly officer advised. "If they feel involved, they're more likely to support your project." With the reality of his ownership sinking in for Karen, her initial anger began to fade, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "Okay," she said slowly, glancing at the officers for support. "I'm willing to listen, but you have to understand that there's a lot of skepticism about change." "Of course," James replied, grateful for her willingness to engage. "I would expect nothing less. Change can be daunting, especially when it feels imposed upon you. I want to approach this as a partner, not an outsider." As the conversation continued, James noticed the subtle shift in Karen's body language. She was beginning to relax, her defensive posture easing as she listened to him. The officers, sensing the positive momentum, began to step back, realizing their work was done for now. "All right, it looks like we've cleared things up here," the woman officer said, her tone friendly. "Mr. James, feel free to continue your inspection. And Karen, if you have further concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to help." With a nod, the officers turned to leave, but Karen hesitated. "Wait," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I didn't mean for things to escalate like this. I'm sorry if I came off too strong." James smiled gently. "It's okay, Karen. We all have our fears and concerns. What matters is that we're here now, willing to communicate." With the police gone, Karen and James stood in a quiet moment, the air between them charged with potential. "So, when do you think this community meeting could happen?" she asked, curiosity tinged with hesitation. "I'll reach out to the local community center and see what dates are available," James replied, eager to make strides in mending the rift that had formed. "Once we have a date, I can distribute flyers and invite everyone to come." "Good idea," Karen said, her voice growing stronger. "I'll help spread the word too. If people see that you're serious about involving us, it might ease their fears." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Karen. Your willingness to engage means a lot. I want to create a space where we can all thrive, and I believe we can do that together." As they parted ways that afternoon, both felt a sense of tentative optimism. They had started a conversation that could lead to understanding, trust, and perhaps even friendship. For James, it was the first step in becoming a part of the community he hoped to serve. For Karen, it was a chance to reconsider her preconceived notions and open her heart to the possibilities of change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land, James walked with purpose, feeling the weight of hope settle into his heart. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he was determined to navigate it with integrity and openness, one conversation at a time. And as Karen returned to her home, she found herself reflecting on the encounter, realizing that perhaps her fears could transform into a shared vision for a brighter future. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment as the police informed her that not only was James within his rights, but she had wasted their time with her baseless accusations. The burly officer's words hit her like a cold splash of water, leaving her momentarily speechless. "You can't just accuse someone based on their appearance," he said sternly, his voice firm but not unkind. The weight of those words pressed heavily on her chest, and she felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting. As the officers continued to explain the importance of understanding and respecting property rights, Karen could feel her defensiveness crumbling. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, she stammered, the realization dawning on her that her intentions, however noble they may have seemed, had been clouded by her prejudices. James, who had remained composed throughout the encounter, stood nearby, observing Karen's reaction. His initial frustration had dissipated, replaced by a deep sense of empathy. He knew all too well the implications of bias and misunderstanding, having faced similar situations in his life. He felt a stirring of compassion for Karen as she struggled to come to terms with the reality of her actions. The officers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "We understand that people can react out of fear," the woman officer said gently. "But it's crucial to address those fears with open communication, not accusations. There are ways to resolve concerns without jumping to conclusions." As the officer spoke, Karen's mind raced with a torrent of thoughts and emotions. She replayed the events in her mind, recalling how her heart had raced with anger at the sight of James, how she had assumed he was a threat simply because he was a black man walking on what she believed was her property. The shame washed over her like a tide, pulling her under with its force. "I'm so sorry," Karen finally said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to make such a serious accusation. I let my fears get the best of me." She glanced at James, her expression filled with remorse. "I didn't even think to ask you what you were doing, or if you had a right to be here." James took a deep breath, appreciating her honesty. "It's okay, Karen," he replied, his tone reassuring. "I understand how easy it is to jump to conclusions, especially when faced with something unfamiliar. But it's essential to challenge those instinctive reactions." The woman officer nodded in agreement. "That's a good point, James. It takes conscious effort to examine our biases and assumptions, especially when they're ingrained in us." Karen, recognizing that is the first step toward growth. Karen felt a flicker of hope amid her embarrassment. "I want to do better," she said earnestly. "I don't want to be that person who judges others based on their appearance. I want to understand and learn, but I don't know where to start." James smiled warmly, appreciating her willingness to change. Engaging with your community is a great place to start. Attend local meetings, get to know your neighbors, and listen to their experiences. You might find that many people share similar hopes and concerns, regardless of their background. "I'd like that," Karen said, her voice gaining strength. "I think I need to understand different perspectives, especially in our increasingly diverse community." She felt a surge of determination as she spoke, realizing that acknowledging her flaws was the beginning of her transformation. The burly officer interjected, "That's a commendable goal, Karen. Educating yourself is crucial. There are resources and workshops that focus on diversity and inclusion, which can provide valuable insights. Would you be willing to share some of those resources with me?" Karen asked, looking directly at the officer, her eyes bright with sincerity. "I want to actively participate in my community's growth and ensure that everyone feels welcome." "Absolutely," the woman officer replied, her demeanor softening. "I can send you information about local workshops, book clubs, and community events centered on these topics. It's wonderful to see you taking this initiative." As the officers wrapped up their conversation, Karen felt a mix of gratitude and shame. "Thank you for your patience with me," she said, her voice steadying. "I truly appreciate you taking the time to explain everything. I realize now how damaging assumptions can be." James nodded in agreement, his expression warm and supportive. "Everyone makes mistakes, Karen. It's part of being human. What matters is how we choose to learn from them." The woman officer added, "Exactly. And it's important to extend that understanding to others as well. We all have a role in creating a community that's inclusive and respectful." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before continuing. "Remember, it's a journey. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a willingness to reflect on our actions." Karen felt a sense of resolve building within her. "I want to be part of that change," she declared, her voice unwavering. "I want to help foster an environment where everyone feels valued and respected, regardless of their background." The officers nodded, pleased with her commitment. That's a great attitude to have. Just keep in mind that it takes time and effort to build those relationships, the burly officer said, offering a supportive smile. But you're already on the right path. As the officers prepared to leave, James took a step closer to Karen. If you're serious about making a change, I'd be happy to work with you, he offered. We can plan that community meeting together and ensure that everyone has a voice. I'd love to hear what ideas you have for the neighborhood. Karen's heart swelled with gratitude. Thank you, James. I'd really like that, she replied, her eyes shining with newfound determination. Let's make this a positive experience for everyone involved. The officers exchanged one last glance before walking back to their patrol car, leaving Karen and James standing together in the warm afternoon sun. The tension that had once hung heavy in the air had dissipated, replaced by a sense of collaboration and mutual respect. As they discussed their plans for the community meeting, Karen felt a growing sense of hope. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but she was ready to embrace it. She envisioned a future where she could foster connections with her neighbors, bridging gaps that had once seemed insurmountable. I'll start working on the details for the meeting, James said, his enthusiasm infectious. Once we have a date, I can reach out to everyone and make sure they know their voices are valued. Karen nodded eagerly. And I'll help promote it. I can post flyers in the community center and online. We need to get the word out so that everyone feels included, she said, her mind racing with ideas. James smiled, impressed by her willingness to take action. That's perfect. Together, we can create a platform for dialogue and understanding. I believe it will make a significant impact on the community. With a sense of purpose igniting within her, Karen felt a transformation beginning to take root. The embarrassment she had felt moments before was fading, replaced by a determination to do better. She knew that the path ahead would require ongoing reflection and commitment, but she was ready to embrace the challenge. As they exchanged contact information, Karen felt a newfound sense of connection with James. Thank you for being so understanding, she said, her voice sincere. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm ready to learn. James nodded, appreciating her tone.
Stay.
We're all learning and growing together. That's what makes a community strong, everyone contributing to the greater good. With plans in motion for the community meeting, they parted ways, each carrying a sense of hope and determination. Karen returned to her home, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She envisioned a neighborhood where fear and misunderstanding could give way to empathy and collaboration, where people came together to celebrate their differences. As the days turned into weeks, Karen became increasingly involved in her community. She attended local events, engaged in conversations with her neighbors, and actively sought out opportunities to learn about the experiences of others. Each interaction enriched her understanding, and she began to see the world through a broader lens. James, too, worked diligently to prepare for the upcoming community meeting. He reached out to local organizations, gathered resources on diversity and inclusion, and sought input from residents about their hopes for the neighborhood. The excitement for the meeting grew, and Karen felt a sense of anticipation building. When the day of the meeting arrived, the community center buzzed with energy. Residents gathered, chatting animatedly, and Karen found herself surrounded by familiar faces. She felt a mixture of nerves and excitement as she prepared to share her vision for fostering inclusivity. James stood at the front of the room, ready to present his plans. He spoke passionately about the importance of community collaboration, emphasizing the need for open dialogue and mutual respect. As he addressed the crowd, Karen felt a swell of pride. She had come a long way since that fateful afternoon, and now she was part of something meaningful. When it was her turn to speak, Karen shared her journey, recounting her initial biases and the lessons she had learned along the way. She spoke candidly about her embarrassment and how it had motivated her to change. The room fell silent as she shared her commitment to creating an inclusive community where everyone felt valued. As the meeting unfolded, ideas flowed freely. Neighbors shared their hopes for the future, and discussions blossomed around how to foster connections and understanding. The sense of camaraderie grew, and Karen felt her heart swell with hope. In that moment, She realized that the road to change would be paved with patience, empathy, and a willingness to learn. But it was a journey worth taking, one that would lead to a brighter, more inclusive future for all. The once embarrassed woman was now a catalyst for change, embracing her role in building a community grounded in understanding and respect. Through the connections forged that day, Karen not only found her place in the neighborhood, but also discovered the power of vulnerability and growth. She learned that change begins with a single step, and she was ready to continue walking that path, hand in hand with her neighbors. As the officers left, James took a moment to address Karen. "I hope this teaches you something about assumptions and biases," he said, his voice steady but firm. He had a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the tense situation that had just unfolded. Karen felt a knot tightening in her stomach, the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her conscience. She nodded slowly, her anger dissipating as the reality of her assumptions settled in. The encounter had transformed her in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend, but she felt a flicker of hope igniting within her. "Thank you for your patience," Karen said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I realize now how wrong I was to assume you were a trespasser, just because of your appearance. I can't believe I let my fears get the best of me." The shame washed over her like a tidal wave, making it hard to breathe. It was a sobering moment, one that she knew would stay with her for a long time. James studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "We all have biases, Karen. It's a part of being human. What matters is how we choose to respond when we recognize them." His words were measured and thoughtful, encouraging her to confront the uncomfortable truths she was beginning to grapple with. Acknowledging your biases is the first step toward change. Feeling vulnerable but determined, Karen took a deep breath. "I want to change," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't want to be that person who jumps to conclusions based on fear or prejudice. I want to understand my neighbors and build a community where everyone feels welcome." The sincerity in her words surprised even her. She had never imagined she would be standing here, bearing her vulnerabilities to a stranger. "Then you're already on the right path," James replied, his voice filled with encouragement. "It's going to take time and effort, but if you're committed, you'll find that people are more understanding than you think. They appreciate honesty and the willingness to learn." As they stood in the fading light of the afternoon, Karen began to reflect on the many ways she had insulated herself from different perspectives over the years. She realized that her bubble had been built from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, and fear of losing control. But this experience had shattered that bubble, exposing her to the raw reality of her own biases. The realization felt both daunting and liberating. "What can I do to start this journey?" she asked, feeling a sense of urgency to begin making amends. "I want to take active steps, not just talk about it." James smiled at her earnestness. "Start by engaging with your community. Attend neighborhood meetings, introduce yourself to your neighbors, and listen to their stories. You'll find that everyone has a unique experience that contributes to our shared community. By opening those lines of communication, you'll not only learn but also build relationships that will foster understanding." Karen nodded, taking mental notes of his suggestions. "I've never been the type to get involved in community events," she admitted. "But I see now that I need to change that. I want to reach out and connect with people instead of avoiding them out of fear." James continued, "It's important to read literature and watch films that offer different perspectives. Stories have a way of challenging our views and helping us see the world through someone else's eyes. They can be powerful tools for empathy." "I love to read," Karen exclaimed, feeling a spark of excitement at the thought of exploring new narratives. "I'll create a reading list focusing on diverse voices and experiences. I think that could really help me understand the complexities of our community." "Great idea," James responded, his enthusiasm infectious. There are also community organizations that focus on inclusion and diversity. Getting involved with them can broaden your understanding even further and give you practical ways to contribute positively. As their conversation unfolded, Karen felt a growing sense of determination. She envisioned her future filled with rich interactions, learning opportunities, and the forging of friendships that transcended differences. The possibilities were endless, and she was eager to embrace them. James, noticing her newfound enthusiasm, added, "It's also essential to practice self-reflection regularly. Take time to assess your thoughts and reactions to various situations. Ask yourself why you felt a certain way and whether those feelings stemmed from biases. This practice will help you develop a greater awareness of your instincts and choices." Karen felt a wave of appreciation for James's insights. "I never considered self-reflection as a tool for growth," she admitted, "but it makes so much sense. I'll keep a journal to track my thoughts and feelings, sort of like a personal accountability partner." "Exactly," he replied, smiling. "And remember, it's okay to make mistakes along the way. Change isn't linear. There will be ups and downs. The key is to remain committed and willing to learn from each experience." Their conversation continued to flow as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. Karen felt a connection forming, a sense of camaraderie that she had not anticipated. The initial tension of their encounter had transformed into a meaningful exchange that left her feeling hopeful and inspired. As they prepared to part ways, James looked at her earnestly. "I believe in your ability to change, Karen. It's not easy, but the journey will be worthwhile. You'll inspire others to reflect on their own biases and join in the efforts to create a more inclusive community." "Thank you, James. I genuinely appreciate your support," she said, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm determined to make a difference, not just for myself, but for everyone in our neighborhood. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." James smiled warmly, the sincerity in his eyes reassuring her. "That's the spirit. Change starts with individuals, and your commitment can spark a ripple effect throughout the community. Just remember, you're not alone in this journey." As they exchanged contact information, Karen felt a sense of empowerment. She was ready to take on the challenge of personal growth and community engagement. In the weeks that followed, she threw herself into her new mission. She attended local events, volunteered for community projects, and immersed herself in literature that broadened her understanding of diversity. Karen discovered a newfound joy in connecting with her neighbors. Each conversation peeled back layers of misunderstanding and revealed shared experiences and dreams. She realized that many of her neighbors had faced similar fears and biases, and together they could work toward building a more inclusive environment. During one community meeting, Karen found herself standing in front of her neighbors, sharing her story of transformation. "I want to apologize for my actions that day when I accused James of trespassing," she began, her voice steady. "It was a moment of weakness fueled by fear and prejudice. But I've learned that we have to challenge those biases if we want to create a truly welcoming community." Her heartfelt admission resonated with those present, and the room buzzed with discussion. Neighbors began to share their own experiences with bias and misunderstanding, creating a space for open dialogue. The conversation flowed naturally, with laughter and camaraderie filling the air. In time, Karen became a catalyst for change within the community. She organized workshops focused on diversity and inclusion, bringing in speakers who share their stories and expertise. She collaborated with local organizations to develop programs that encourage dialogue among residents of different backgrounds. As the months went by, Karen noticed a shift in her neighborhood. More people began engaging in community events, and a sense of unity blossomed. The work she had initiated, alongside James and other residents, was creating a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. One afternoon, as she walked through the neighborhood, Karen spotted James working on his construction project. She approached him with a smile. "James, I wanted to thank you for being a part of this journey," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Your willingness to engage and share your perspective has made a significant impact on our community." James looked up, his expression warm and appreciative. "It's been inspiring to see the changes unfold, Karen. You've taken the initiative to create a space for dialogue and understanding. That's something to be proud of." They stood together, reflecting on the journey they had both undertaken. Karen felt a profound sense of fulfillment as she watched her community grow closer and more inclusive. The shame she once felt had transformed into a sense of purpose. "I've learned so much about the power of empathy and connection," Karen said thoughtfully. It's amazing how one encounter can lead to such significant change. James nodded in agreement. Absolutely. It's a testament to how important it is to challenge our assumptions and engage with one another. We have to remember that we're all part of the same community, and together, we can create a better future. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Karen felt a sense of peace enveloping her. She had faced her biases, taken responsibility for her actions, and committed herself to fostering understanding and inclusivity. The journey ahead was still long, but she was ready to walk it, hand in hand with her neighbors. In that moment, Karen realized that change was not just about her personal growth. It was about building a community where everyone felt valued and respected. And she was proud to be a part of that transformation, embracing the diversity that made her neighborhood vibrant and alive. The encounter with James had not only changed her perspective, it had become a catalyst for a collective movement, inspiring others to reflect on their own biases and engage in meaningful conversations. As she continued to nurture these connections, Karen knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and triumphs, but she was ready to face them with an open heart and a determined spirit. Through the lessons she had learned and the relationships she had forged, Karen found her place within a community that thrived on understanding and acceptance. The once isolated woman had become a beacon of hope, illuminating the path toward a more inclusive and compassionate future for all. And in doing so, she had discovered her own capacity for change, proving that anyone could rise above their biases and embrace the beauty of diversity.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.